At 40, Miss Carlyon, one really ought to have stopped hoping. The words carried clean across the punch table, pitched just loud enough to be overheard, and Duke Fendrel of Rudmind, entering the Ashcombe Assembly rooms a full hour later than courtesy required, heard them before he had even surrendered his greatcoat. He stopped in the doorway. Candlelight rippled gold along the walls, catching on epaulettes and pearl combs and the nervous, avaricious eyes of every mother in the room who had a daughter to dispose of, and for a moment none of them mattered at all, 'cause his gaze had already gone to the woman the remark had been aimed at. She did not flinch. That was the first thing he noticed, before he knew her name, before he knew anything of her at all, that the barb had struck true enough to make a lesser creature colour or falter, and she had done neither. She simply set down the cup she had been filling for an elderly lady beside her, finished the small kindness she had been performing, and said, with a composure that was somehow more devastating than any blush could have been, "Then it is fortunate, Mrs. Pentreath, that I gave up the habit some years ago. It leaves so much less to be disappointed by." A ripple of laughter went round, not with her quite, but not entirely against her either, and the woman who had spoken, stout matron in puce silk with a face built for disapproval, reddened and turned to her companion, a girl of perhaps 19 with ringlets the colour of good sherry, and an expression of practised boredom that Fendrel recognised at once as belonging to Miss Arabella Trewillard, whose mother had written to his aunt no fewer than 4 times that season regarding the merits of an autumn wedding. He had come to Ashcombe entirely against his own inclination. His aunt, Lady Iseult, had worn him down over a fortnight of dinners with the patient relentlessness of water on stone, till he had agreed to attend one assembly in order that the county might stop whispering he had turned into his father's ghost, haunting Rudmind's corridors and refusing to so much as look at a woman under 60. He had meant to stand at the edge of the room for the required half-hour, bow to whichever dowagers demanded it, and depart before the second set formed. He was aware, standing in the doorway with his greatcoat still half off his shoulders, of the particular hush that always attended his entrances now, not the respectful quiet owed to rank, but something warrior, more calculating, the hush of a room recalibrating its ambitions in an instant. He had grown used to it, the way one grows used to a persistent ache, without ever quite ceasing to feel its weight. 6 years of it. 6 years of being watched not as a man but as a prize to be angled for, a set of figures on an income statement dressed in a good coat, and he had begun, somewhere in the 3rd or 4th of those years, to wonder whether any woman in this county would ever look at him and see anything else. Instead he found himself watching a woman in a gown of dove-grey silk, unfashionable by at least 2 seasons, her dark hair dressed with a plainness that made every elaborately curled head around her look faintly ridiculous, standing quite alone against the wall with the serenity of someone who had long since stopped expecting to be asked to dance and had made her peace with it. Charles, he did not turn his head, Sir Charles Pengelly, who had known him since they were boys thrashing about the Rudmind trout streams together, materialized at his elbow with the particular alacrity of a man who had been waiting all evening for his friend to show a single flicker of interest in anything other than estate ledgers. "Your Grace." "Don't." Fendrel's mouth twitched despite himself. "Who is that woman?" "The one in grey, by the elder lady with the fan." Charles followed his gaze and made a small sound of recognition. "Miss Corenza Carlyon, old Cornish family, not much money left in it, though there was more once. Her father's place is Nansmere, out past the Rudmind homewood. You'd have ridden by it 100 times without noticing. Good land, badly managed these 20 years. He paused, and something in his voice softened in a way that made Fendrel look at him properly. "She nursed her mother through a wasting illness for the better part of a decade, from the time she was 21 until Mrs. Carlyon died, raised her younger brother and sister into the bargain more or less, while her father grieved himself half into the grave and needed nursing of his own. By the time the 2 young ones were settled, the brother's a solicitor in Truro now, married, the sister wed a curate somewhere Devon way. Miss Carlyon was past 35 and there was no one left for her. There rarely is for women who spend their best years in a sick room." He glanced sideways. "Why do you ask?" Fendrel did not answer at once. He was watching the elderly lady beside Corenza Carlyon sway, very slightly, the fan slipping from her fingers. The heat of the room and the crush of bodies clearly proving too much for her. And he was watching Miss Carlyon catch it, the whole business, before anyone else in the room had so much as noticed anything amiss. She had the old woman's arm in an instant, was easing her toward a chair with an economy of movement that spoke of long practice, murmuring something that made the lady laugh weakly even as she was fanned and settled and given water, all without a single wasted gesture, without drawing a particle of attention to herself in the doing of it. It was, he thought, the least performed kindness he had witnessed in a ballroom in 15 years. Every other woman in the room performed. They performed grace, performed modesty, performed delight at partners they despised, at indifference to partners they coveted. Miss Carlyon, quite plainly, had stopped performing for this room a long time ago, because the room had stopped watching her, and there was something almost unbearably honest in the shape that made of her. "She is not accounted a beauty I collect," Fendrel said, mostly to himself. Charles gave a short laugh. "She is accounted invisible, Fendrel, which in this town is a good deal worse. 40 years old this spring. I know because my sister mentioned it, with some pity, at supper not a week past. There isn't a mother in Ashcombe who regards her as anything but furniture. Comfortable furniture, mind. Everyone likes her. No one thinks of her. I am thinking of her." Charles turned and looked at him properly then, and whatever he saw in his friend's face made him fall silent for a long moment. The noise of the assembly rushing back into the space where their conversation had been, the scrape of the orchestra tuning, Lady Truillard's determined laughter 3 yards off, the particular percussive gaiety of a room full of people all trying very hard to be seen enjoying themselves. "Fendrel," Charles said slowly, "you have not danced at an Ashcombe assembly in 6 years. You have not, so far as I am aware, danced with anyone who was not your aunt or a bride at her own wedding in considerably longer than that. If you cross this room to speak to Corenza Carlyon, every soul in it will have remarked upon it and reconstructed the whole history of your acquaintance with her by the time the tea-urns come round, and she will bear the weight of that speculation a great deal longer than you will, because she is the one who must go on living here." It was fair warning and fairly meant, and Fendrel knew Charles well enough to hear the genuine care beneath it. He thought of his own 6 years, the ledgers, the drainage disputes. The long grey stretch after his mother's death, when Rudmind had felt less a home than a debt he was perpetually paying down, one useless season after another. While his aunt fretted and the county gossiped, and no woman he was introduced to ever seemed to want anything from him beyond the coronet and the income attached to his name. He had grown so accustomed to being wanted for what he was rather than who he was that he had very nearly stopped attending to the difference. He watched Corenza Carlyon settle the old lady's shawl about her shoulders and say something that made the woman pat her hand, fondly. The gesture of long affection rather than obligation, and he understood with the sudden clean certainty of a man who has spent a decade making difficult decisions and has learned to trust the moment such certainty arrives, that he did not care in the least what the room reconstructed. He thought, briefly and unbidden, of his mother in the last year of her life, when the illness had stripped away everything superfluous in her and left only the plain truth of what she valued, and what she had valued, in the end, above every title and every acre of Rudmind land, was the handful of people who had troubled to know her rather than her position. She had asked him once, weeks before she died, whether he meant to spend the whole of his life being useful to everyone and known by no one, and he had not had a good answer for her then. He was not certain he had a good answer for it now, but he thought, watching a woman in grey silk perform an unwitnessed kindness at the edge of a crowded room, that he had perhaps just been given the first real opportunity in 3 years to attempt one. "I have known you since we were 9 years old, Charles," he said, "and in all that time I have asked your advice perhaps a dozen times and taken it perhaps twice. I find I am not inclined to make this the 3rd occasion." He set down the glass he had not realized he was still holding, straightened his coat with the automatic gesture of a man about to do something he had not planned for, and began to walk. Lady Truillard intercepted him before he had gone 3 yards, materializing with the speed of a woman who had spent the whole evening positioning herself for precisely this trajectory, her daughter arranged at her side like a piece of good china set out for inspection. Your Grace. What a very great pleasure. Arabella has been longing all evening for the chance to stand up for the next set, have you not, my love? And I, Mr. Pentreth, was only just remarking how well suited. You are very kind, Lady Truellard. Fendrel inclined his head with the precise, chilling courtesy that had earned him, among the mothers of Ashcombe, a reputation for arrogance he had never troubled to correct, chiefly because correcting it would have required more of his patience than any of them merited. Miss Truellard, I hope you will forgive me. I find I am promised elsewhere this set. Promised elsewhere, Lady Truellard repeated, her smile faltering just enough to betray her surprise, for she had, by her own later admission to half the drawing-rooms of Ashcombe, arranged her whole evening's campaign around the certainty that no other lady in the room had thought to secure the Duke's attention before her. I had not realized your Grace was previously engaged. I do hope it is nothing that will prevent you joining us at supper, for I have had cook prepare a syllabub. I know Arabella has been longing for you to try, have you not, my love? Arabella, who had not, in point of fact, expressed any longing whatsoever regarding syllabub within her mother's hearing, managed a thin smile that did not reach her eyes, and Fendrel found himself, not for the first time that season, faintly sorry for a girl who seemed to have very little say in the campaign being waged on her behalf. Something in his tone must have carried, because Lady Truellard's smile did not so much fall as freeze, holding its shape while every particle of warmth drained out of it, and Arabella's boredom sharpened, for just an instant, into something considerably more alert. He did not wait to see what either of them made of it. He walked on, past the punch table, past Mrs. Pentreth's astonished face, past a dozen other groups that fell into silence as he passed and resumed their conversation, transformed, the instant he was out of earshot, and came to a stop before a woman in a dove gown who was, at that precise moment, looking anywhere in the room but at him, because it had plainly not occurred to her that he might be walking toward her at all. Miss Carleon, he bowed. I do not believe we have been introduced. I am Rudemind. She looked up, and he watched the whole practiced serenity of her face falter, not into the coyness he had seen 100 times from 100 young women informed of his rank, but into something far more honest, a startled, searching bewilderment, as though she suspected some jest was being played at her expense and was bracing herself to meet it with dignity. Your Grace. Her curtsy was correct, economical, entirely without flutter. I am aware of who you are. Ashcombe has spoken of little else since your arrival was announced. Her chin lifted, very slightly, and he found himself absurdly pleased by the small defiance of it. I confess I am at something of a loss to know why you have crossed the room to say so to me. Because I watched you tend to Mrs. Kessel's fainting turn better than any hostess in this room would have managed it, he said, without once appearing to notice you were doing anything remarkable at all. And because I understood, some minutes ago, from Mrs. Pentreth's charming observation regarding your advanced age and extinguished hopes, that you are a woman this room has decided is beneath its notice. He watched the words land, watched her go very still. I find I disagree with the room's judgment rather strongly, Miss Carleon, and I have not yet worked out how to so quietly. The orchestra struck up the opening bars of the next set. Around them, 40 pairs of eyes that had been very carefully not watching turned, as one, unmistakably, to watch. Corenza Carleon looked at him for a long moment, long enough that he began to wonder if he had mistaken her entirely, if the composure he had admired concealed nothing warmer than good manners after all. And then something shifted in her face, a wariness giving ground, reluctantly, to a curiosity she could not quite suppress. That is a very great deal to say to a woman you have known for the length of a sentence, Your Grace. Then dance with me, Fendrel said, and held out his hand, and I will have the length of a set to attempt to say something wiser. She looked down at his hand as though it were a question she had not expected to be asked twice in her life, and for one unbearable moment he thought she would refuse him, would retreat back into the safety of 40 years spent expecting nothing, where at least the disappointment was familiar and could not surprise her. Then slowly she set her fingers against his palm, and the whole room, he was quite certain, drew in its breath at once. Very well, Your Grace, she said, and there was something in her voice, not quite hope, not yet, but the ghost of a thing that had once been hope and had not entirely forgotten the shape of itself. "Let us see how wise you can manage to be." Her hand was steady in his, which surprised him more than it ought to have. In his experience, women who found themselves suddenly and unexpectedly the object of a duke's attention trembled, or simpered, or grew so flustered with calculation that conversation with them became a species of chess. Corenza Carleon merely took her place in the set with the composed economy of a woman who had danced 100 times before, and had long ago stopped attaching any great significance to the exercise. "You dance very well, Miss Carleon," he said, when the figure brought them together. "I have had a great deal of practice not being asked to," she said, "which leaves one a good deal of leisure to observe how it ought to be done." The corner of her mouth moved, not quite a smile, but its close relation. "You need not look so alarmed, Your Grace." It was meant as a joke, though I grant you a poor one. I was not alarmed. I was recalculating. The figure separated them again, and he found himself absurdly counting the bars until it would bring them back together. When it did, he said, "I have spent this evening being told by every mother in the room precisely how her daughter would suit me," in tones that suggested the matter had already been settled in her own mind some years prior. "You are the first person tonight to say anything to me that was not, in some fashion, a transaction. Give it time," she said. "I have not yet worked out what I want from you." He laughed, an unguarded sound, startled out of him, and he saw her look up at that, genuinely surprised, as though the notion that she might make a duke laugh had not occurred to her as a possibility available to a woman of her years and her grey silk. "That," he said, "is the first honest thing that has been said to me at an Ashcombe assembly in 6 years. Then Ashcombe has grown very dull indeed, or very dishonest, and I cannot decide which is the worse indictment." She turned under his hand, the movement unhurried, and when she came back her expression had settled into something more guarded. "You must forgive me, Your Grace, if I do not entirely trust the occasion. I have lived in this county 40 years. I know precisely how it regards me, and I confess I find it difficult to credit that a man of your position has crossed a crowded room expressly to contradict the general opinion, out of nothing more than a fondness for lost causes. I do not consider you a lost cause." "No," she agreed. "You consider me a curiosity. It amounts to much the same thing by morning, when the novelty has worn thin and you have remembered there are a dozen younger, prettier, wealthier women in this room who would give a great deal to stand where I am standing." He turned this over as the figure carried them apart again, and found, when it returned them together, that he wanted very much to answer it properly rather than gallantly. "I buried my mother 3 years ago," he said, quietly enough that it would not carry beyond the two of them. "Before that, my father a decade past, and rather suddenly. I inherited Rudmind at 26 with debts I did not fully understand and tenants who did not trust a boy to manage them, and I have spent every season since attempting to prove to the county that I was equal to what had been left me. I do not say this so that you will pity me. I say it because I suspect you understand, better than any woman in this room, what it is to give the whole of one's youth to an obligation nobody thought whether you wished to shoulder." Something in her face changed then, not softened precisely, but opened a fraction, the wariness giving way to a recognition that seemed to cost her something to admit even to herself. "My mother was ill for 9 years, she said. A wasting sickness that took its time about the business and permitted no one any illusions of recovery. I was 21 when it began. I had a young man, Your Grace, if you will permit the confidence, Mr. Nathaniel Pascoe, of a very respectable family near Bodmin, who had asked my father for me not 2 months before my mother's illness was confirmed, and who discovered, once it became apparent that I would be some years in the sick room rather than in his drawing room, that his affections were considerably more portable than he had led me to believe." Her voice did not waver, but there was a precision to it, a carefulness, that told him the wound had healed over a scar rather than clean skin. "He married a Miss Trebilcock the following spring. I nursed my mother a further 8 years, raised my brother and sister in the intervals, and by the time I was free to think of my own prospects again, I discovered the county had quietly filed me under spinster and moved on to more promising material. I do not say this to solicit your sympathy either, Your Grace. I say it so that you understand precisely what you are proposing to be curious about. May I ask you something in return, Miss Carleon, and trust you to answer it as plainly as you have answered everything else tonight? You may ask. I make no promise as to the plainness, though I confess I seem to have mislaid the habit of discretion somewhere between the punch table and this set. Do you regret it? The years given to your mother, to your brother and sister? I do not ask to wound you. I ask because I have spent a decade being told, by everyone from my aunt to my own steward, that my own years of duty were a debt owed and therefore beneath regretting, and I have never quite believed them. And I find myself curious whether a woman who gave a great deal more than I did feels the same private treachery in wondering what she might have had instead. She was quiet long enough that he thought she mightn't answer at all, her eyes fixed somewhere past his shoulder as the figure turned them slowly beneath the candlelight. I regret it in the small hours, she said at last, when I cannot sleep and the house is very quiet and I allow myself, for perhaps a quarter of an hour, to imagine the other life, the one where I married at 22 and had children of my own now nearly grown, and a house that was mine rather than my father's, and a husband who came in from the fields at dusk expecting me. I allow myself that quarter of an hour, Your Grace, and then I get up, and I make myself useful to whoever needs me that morning, and I do not think of it again until the next time the house is quiet. It is not regret, precisely. It is closer to grief for a stranger I might have been, if the illness had chosen someone else's mother instead of mine. I loved my own mother a great deal too much to regret the giving only, sometimes, the size of what the giving cost. That is not treachery, Fendrel said. That is simply honesty, which I begin to think you have a great deal more practice at than most people twice your acquaintance with me tonight. The set drew to its close around them, other couples bowing and turning away toward the refreshment tables, but Fendrel did not move at once, and after a moment neither did she. I am not curious about you, Miss Carleon, he said. I am, I think, rather more than that, though I grant we have known each other the length of one dance, and it would be presumptuous of me to name the feeling more precisely than I have earned the right to. It would, she agreed, but there was less certainty in it now, a crack of something warmer showing through the composed grey of her. He offered his arm, and after the smallest hesitation she took it, and he walked her from the floor toward the row of chairs where Mrs. Kessel waited. Considerably restored, watching the two of them approach with an expression of frank and delighted astonishment that she made no effort whatsoever to disguise. "Carenza, my dear," the old woman said, "I begin to think I ought to faint more often, if it produces introductions of this quality." "Hush, Aunt Deborah." But Carenza's colour was up now, faintly, and Fendrel found he liked the sight of it a great deal, proof that the composure was armour rather than nature, that beneath it there was a woman capable of being moved. He bowed to Mrs. Kessel, who he understood now to be some connection of aunt by marriage rather than blood, and turned back to Carenza with the particular determination of a man who has decided, mid-conversation, upon a course he does not intend to abandon merely because it is unorthodox. "Your Grace," Mrs. Kessel put in, before he could speak, her sharp old eyes moving between the two of them with evident delight, "you must forgive an old woman's plain speaking, but I have known this girl the whole of her life. And I have watched a great many young men look at her over the years without ever once troubling to see her properly. You looked at her properly, sir, from clear across the room, and I noticed it before she did, which at my age is one of the few pleasures left to me, noticing things before the young people notice them for themselves." "Aunt Deborah," Carenza said again, with rather more feeling this time, though the corner of her mouth had curved despite herself, "you are embarrassing us both. I am delighting myself, which is a different matter entirely. And at my age I have earned the distinction." The old woman waved her fan toward them both with the satisfied air of a woman who considered her work for the evening substantially complete, and turned her attention, with theatrical discretion, to the refreshment table instead. "Miss Carleon, I wonder whether I might call upon you at Nansmere tomorrow, if your father would receive me, or whatever day would be most convenient to your household." Across the room, he was aware, without needing to look, that Lady Truellard had gone quite rigid, that Mrs. Pentreth's fan had stilled mid-flutter. The general hum of the assembly had contracted, very slightly, around the small space where he stood. He did not care. He had spent 6 years being careful, being correct, being exactly what Rudmind and the county required of him, and he found, standing before a woman in unfashionable grey silk who had just told him the truth of her whole life without once asking anything of him in return, that he was tired of being careful. Corenza did not answer at once. He watched her weigh it, watched the calculation move behind her eyes, the same calculation he suspected, that had governed every decision of the last 19 years. What it would cost her to hope, against what it would cost her not to. "You understand," she said at last, low, so that only he could hear it, "that if you call at Nansmere and are seen to call at Nansmere, this county will talk of nothing else for a month. And if you call once, out of some passing gallantry, and do not call again, I shall be the object of considerably more pity than Mrs. Pentreth's little remark earned me tonight. I have borne being overlooked, your grace, for a very long time, and I have made a tolerable peace with it. I am not certain I could bear being pitied on a grander scale. Then I will not call once," he said. "I give you my word on that, for whatever a word given after one dance is worth to you. I do not do things by halves, Miss Carlyon. It is, I am reliably informed by my aunt, one of my chief faults." Something flickered across her face, surprise, and beneath the surprise, unmistakably, the small green shoot of something she had thought long dead in herself, struggling up through ground she had believed frozen past all thawing. "Then you had better come to Nansmere on Thursday," she said. "My father takes his tea at 4, and grows considerably more amiable once he has had it. You will want him amiable, your grace, before you tell him whatever it is you appear to have decided to tell him." "I have decided nothing yet," Fendrel said, though even as he said it he understood it was not entirely true. "I have only crossed a room. Dukes do not cross rooms for women the room has forgotten," she said, without some decision already half made. "I have watched this county's ambitions play out across 30 ballrooms, your grace. I know the shape of intent when I see it walking toward me." But she was not retreating as she said it. If anything, she stood a little straighter, meeting his eyes with the same steady directness she had shown the entire conversation, as though she had decided, in the space of one dance, that whatever this was, she would meet it honestly or not meet it at all. "Thursday," he said. "Thursday," she agreed, and dropped a curtsy that was, for the first time that evening, not entirely composed, a fraction unsteady, a fraction quick, as though the ground beneath her had shifted in a way she had not yet found her balance upon. He bowed and withdrew, aware of Charles falling into step beside him before he had gone 5 paces, aware of Lady Truellard's fixed smile and Mrs. Pentreth's whispering and 40 pairs of eyes recalculating, in real time, the entire architecture of what they had believed to be true about the world. "Well," Charles said low, "you have certainly given them something to discuss besides the weather. Let them discuss it." Fendrel did not look back, though he was aware, with a clarity that startled him, precisely where in the room she stood. Precisely how she held herself now that his back was turned, a small, private awareness that felt entirely new to him and entirely unwelcome to relinquish. "I find, Charles, that I do not much care what Ashcombe makes of it. I have not felt anything worth caring about in a very long while, and I am not inclined to surrender it merely because Lady Truellard finds it inconvenient to her plans. You have known her a single dance, Fendrel, and already you speak of caring about something for the first time in a very long while. I do not say that to caution you. God knows I have spent 3 years wishing something would shake you loose of the grey mood that settled on you after your mother's passing, but I confess I did not expect it to happen in the space of one set at an Ashcombe assembly. Over a woman neither of us had troubled to notice before tonight." "Neither did I," Fendrel admitted. "I do not have a tidy explanation for it, Charles, beyond the plain fact that I asked her a question and she gave me an honest answer, and I cannot remember the last time that happened to me in a ballroom, or indeed anywhere at all outside my own study. It is a very small thing to build a conviction upon. I am aware of that. I find I do not much care." Charles studied him for a long moment, and whatever he saw settled something in his own expression, concern giving way slowly to a kind of cautious gladness. "Thursday, then," he said. "I shall want a full account, Fendrel, and I warn you I intend to be insufferable about it for weeks." "I would expect nothing less," Fendrel said, and for the first time in longer than he cared to number, he left an Ashcombe assembly wanting very much for the next day to arrive. By Wednesday morning, according to Charles, who made a point of riding over from his own place expressly to report it, the story had acquired no fewer than 4 distinct and mutually contradictory versions in circulation about Ashcombe. In the first, Fendrel had danced with Miss Carleone on a wager. In the second, he had mistaken her for someone else entirely and been too proud to correct the error once made. In the third, most malicious and, Charles reported with some relish, most popular among Lady Truillard's particular circle, he had done it deliberately to humiliate Arabella Truillard for some imagined slight, using poor Miss Carleone as an instrument in a quarrel that had nothing to do with her. "And the fourth?" Fendrel asked, not looking up from the letter he was drafting to his steward regarding the drainage of the Lower Home Farm, a matter that seemed, this particular morning, considerably less urgent than it had the week before. "The fourth," Charles said, settling into the chair opposite the estate-room desk with the easy familiarity of a man who had been let into every room at Rudminde since boyhood, "holds that you have genuinely taken a fancy to her, and is regarded by everyone who subscribes to it as the most far-fetched of the 4. Fendrel set down his pen. "And what do you subscribe to?" "I subscribe to what I saw with my own eyes, which was a man I have known 30 years cross a room he had spent an hour avoiding. In order to speak to the one woman in it he had any earthly reason to avoid speaking to if he wished to keep his life uncomplicated." Charles's tone had lost its teasing edge. "I am glad of it, Fendrel, whatever it turns out to be. You have been half a ghost in this county for longer than is good for you. But I will say this once, as your friend rather than your audience, and then I will hold my tongue on the subject entirely. Miss Carleone has very little left to lose by being humiliated a second time in her life, because everyone assumes there is nothing left in her to break. I do not believe that is true. I believe there is a great deal still in her capable of breaking, and I should not like to watch you be the one who does it, however unintentionally." It was fair, and it settled into Fendrel with the particular weight of a thing he had already half considered, and had not yet permitted himself to examine too closely. He thought of her face across the assembly floor, the wariness, the honesty, the careful arithmetic of hope against disappointment that she had performed in front of him without troubling to disguise it. He thought that he understood, rather better than Charles gave him credit for, precisely what he stood to cost her if he mishandled this. He thought, too, of his own mother's counsel, given to him once when he was very young and had come home from school bruised by some small cruelty. He could no longer remember the particulars of that the measure of a man was not how he behaved when the whole world was watching, but how he behaved toward the one person no one troubled to watch at all. He had not thought of that counsel in years. It returned to him now with a clarity that felt less like memory than instruction, as though she had left it for him to find precisely when he would need it most. "I do not intend to treat this lightly, Charles," he said again, more to himself than to his friend. "Whatever comes of it, I do not intend that. I intend to be careful with her, Charles," he said. "I have never in my life intended anything more. Nansmere." When he rode out to it on Thursday afternoon, proved smaller than he had imagined and better kept than Charles's description of a neglected fortune had led him to expect, a modest grey stone house set into a fold of land above a stream. Its gardens plainly tended by someone who loved them rather than merely maintained them for appearance, roses trained along a south wall with the kind of patient, unfashionable care that spoke of years rather than a single season's fashion. Carenza met him in the hall herself, before a servant could be summoned to the door, which told him something about the size of the household and considerably more about her own disinclination to stand on ceremony she did not feel. "Your Grace." She had changed her gown for something in a soft green that suited her a good deal better than the assembly grey, though he suspected, from the slight self-consciousness with which she smoothed it, that the choice had cost her some private deliberation. "My father is in the small parlour. I ought to warn you he has been in a state of some agitation since Tuesday, when the whole business reached him by way of 3 separate callers before I had the chance to explain it myself. Should I be alarmed? Only if you dislike being questioned rather closely about your income, your intentions, and your opinion of the reform question, roughly in that order. But there was warmth beneath the dryness now, unmistakable, and he found himself absurdly gladdened by the sight of her standing in her own hall, in her own gown, without the assembly's watching eyes to make her guard herself so carefully. Mr. Edmund Carleon proved to be a spare, silver-haired man of perhaps 70, seated by the parlour window with a rug over his knees despite the mildness of the afternoon, his eyes sharp despite the evident frailty of the rest of him. He did not rise, but he extended a hand that trembled faintly with age rather than nerves, and studied Fendral's face for a long moment with an attention that suggested he was taking the full measure of the man before permitting a single word of pleasantry to pass between them. "Your Grace." His voice was drier than his daughter's, but carried the same underlying steadiness. "I confess I did not expect, at my age, to receive a duke in my parlour on Corenza's account. She has had callers before, you understand, in her younger years. Not so many as she deserved. Fewer, I am ashamed to say, than her sister had, though her sister never nursed her mother through 9 years of illness nor kept this house running on very little while I was fit for nothing but grief." His eyes did not leave Fendral's face. "I would know your intentions plainly, sir, if you have any beyond curiosity, before I permit this to go one step further. My daughter has been disappointed once already by a man who found duty inconvenient once it grew costly. I will not sit by and watch it happen a second time, dukedom or no dukedom." Fendral had been questioned by harder men than Edmund Carleon, creditors, tenants who doubted a boy could hold an estate together, his own father in the last hard years before his death, but he found he respected the old man's directness more than he had expected to, and answered it in kind. "I have no intentions, I am ashamed to state plainly, sir. I met your daughter 3 days ago, and I have thought of little else since. I am aware that is a short acquaintance upon which to build a great deal, and I do not ask you to take my word alone for what I mean by it. I ask only that you permit me to call honestly without concealment, so that both you and Miss Carleon may judge for yourselves whether what I feel has any substance to it, or whether it is, as I imagine half of Ashcombe already suspects, some passing fancy that will not survive a fortnight's acquaintance." He held the old man's gaze. "I do not think it will prove to be the latter, Mr. Carleon, but I would rather you judged that for yourself than took it on my assurance." Something in Edmund Carleon's face eased, very slightly, not trust, not yet, but the withdrawal of an immediate suspicion, replaced by something more like cautious attention. "Well," he said, "that is at least an honest answer, which is more than I had from the last young man who sat in that chair and told my daughter he loved her." He gestured toward the window seat. "Sit down, your Grace, and tell me what you know of drainage. My own home farm has been arguing with me about it for a decade, and I find I have grown too old to argue back with any real conviction." It was not, Fendral reflected afterward, the conversation he had expected to have with the father of a woman he was courting, but it suited him better than any amount of gallantry could have. He spoke of drainage and of tenant leases, and of the difficulty of managing land that had been neglected before it came into his hands, and found Edmund Carleon's questions sharp and well-informed despite his evident frailty, and understood, somewhere in the course of an hour's conversation about hedgerows and field drains, that the old man was testing him in the only currency he had left to test a duke with not rank, not fortune, but competence and care, and the plain evidence of a man who took his responsibilities seriously rather than merely wearing them as an ornament. "You will forgive an old man's suspicion, your Grace," Edmund Carleon said at one point, setting down the estate map Fendral had unrolled across the small parlour table to illustrate a point about culverts, "but I have learned, in 70 years, that a man's true character shows itself a great deal more plainly in how he speaks of his tenants' hardships than in how he speaks of his own prospects. You have spoken twice now of a family on your northern boundary whose cottage roof failed last winter, and both times you spoke of it as though their trouble were your own to solve rather than theirs to endure. I find I credit that more than I would credit any number of pretty speeches about my daughter's fine eyes." He permitted himself a dry, private smile. Not that she does not have fine eyes, only that I have grown tired in my long life of men who notice eyes and nothing else. I have noticed a great deal else, sir, Fendrel said, though I confess the eyes did not escape me either. Edmund Carleon laughed outright at that, a short, surprised bark of real amusement, and Carenza, glancing up from her needlework, looked at her father with an expression of such open gladness that Fendrel understood, watching her, precisely how long it had been since she had heard that particular sound in her own parlour. Carenza sat through most of it with her needlework in her lap, saying little, but he was aware of her throughout, aware of the small smile she did not quite suppress when her father grew animated over a point of husbandry, aware of the quick, searching glances she sent Fendrel's way when she believed herself unobserved, as though she were still 3 days on, attempting to reconcile the man before her with whatever story her whole life had taught her to expect of dukes. When at last Edmund Carleon's energy flagged, and he permitted himself to be persuaded toward his afternoon rest, Carenza walked Fendrel out through the garden rather than the hall. Along the path bordered by the roses he had noticed on his arrival, the late afternoon light turning the grey stone of the house gold behind them. "You did not need to speak with him for an hour about drainage," she said, "to secure my good opinion, your grace. I had already half decided in your favour before you arrived, which I confess is not a thing I have said aloud to anyone in a very long time. I did not do it to secure your good opinion." He stopped beside the roses, and she stopped with him, and for a moment neither of them said anything at all, the stream below the garden wall making its small constant sound in the silence. "I did it because I wanted to understand the man who raised you, and because I found, somewhat to my own surprise, that I liked him a great deal, quite apart from any bearing it has on my suit. He liked you too." I could tell. She looked down at the roses rather than at him, her fingers moving absently to touch a bloom that had not quite opened. "He has not spoken so much in an afternoon since before my mother died. He used to talk a great deal, you know, when I was young, about everything, about nothing, about the whole shape of the world as he saw it. Grief took most of that from him, and I have missed it more than I let myself admit. Then I am glad to have given him back an hour of it." Fendrel watched her hand on the rose, and found himself wanting, with an intensity that startled him, to close the small distance between his own hand and hers, to see what it would feel like to have her fingers rest against his rather than against a flower she was using, he suspected, as a place to put her attention so that she would not have to look at him directly. He did not do it. It was too soon, and he had promised her, promised himself, more truthfully, that he would not do this by halves, which meant doing it properly, at the pace her long-guarded heart required, rather than the pace his own certainty was urging upon him. "I shall call again on Sunday, if I may," he said instead, after church, "and I hope you will permit me to walk with you, rather than merely sit in your father's parlour discussing field drains, agreeable as that conversation proved. You may call whenever you like." "Your Grace." She looked up at him then, and there was something in her face he had not seen there before, not the wariness of the assembly, not even the cautious warmth of the last hour, but something more naked than either. A hope she had plainly given up trying to suppress and had not yet decided what to do with now that it had returned. "I find I have very little practice left at pretending I do not wish to see you again. It is, I think, rather too late in my life to begin pretending now." He left Nansmere with the particular lightness of a man who has been handed something he had believed, until very recently, was no longer available to him, and it was not until he was halfway back to Rodmind, the evening closing soft and gold over home wood, that a rider overtook him on the road, breathless, with a message from his aunt that made the lightness curdle, all at once, into something considerably more urgent. Lady Isolde had received a caller that afternoon, Mrs. Pentreth, full of righteous concern, bearing news that Nathaniel Pascoe, widowed these 18 months and newly returned to Bodmin to settle his late wife's estate, had been heard to say, in company, that he intended to call upon Miss Carleon before the month was out, and had expressed considerable confidence that old affections, once so warmly returned, were rarely so easily forgotten by a woman who had waited this long without another offer worth the accepting. Fendrel read the note twice by the last of the evening light, standing in the road with his horse blowing softly beside him, and felt the whole warm ease of the afternoon contract, all at once into something considerably harder and more watchful. He told himself, riding the rest of the way home in the deepening dusk, that it was no business of jealousy, that he had known Corenza Carleon 4 days, and had no claim upon her beyond what she had freely chosen to grant him, and that a woman of her evident good sense was hardly likely to be swayed by a man who had already once proved the shallowness of his own affections when they grew inconvenient to maintain. But he found the reasoning did little to loosen the tightness in his chest, and understood, somewhat ruefully, that he had arrived, in the space of a single week, at exactly the condition his aunt had been hoping to see in him for 3 long years, entirely, helplessly invested in the happiness of one particular woman, and considerably less equanimous about the prospect of losing her than his own pride cared to admit. He did not sleep well that night, which he told himself was foolish, and told himself again the next morning, and found the telling did nothing whatsoever to loosen the tightness that had settled in his chest since the messenger's news had reached him on the Nansmer road. It was not, he reasoned with himself over a breakfast he barely touched, that he doubted her. He had known Corenza Carleon 4 days, which was scarcely long enough to have earned the right to doubt or trust her on any matter so weighty as an old attachment. But he had watched her face when she spoke of Nathaniel Pascoe at the assembly, had seen the careful precision with which she had told that story, the scar rather than the open wound, and he did not want to believe, that a man's belated return, 18 months a widower and evidently in one of a comfortable second establishment, could undo in a week what 19 years of quiet dignity had built in her. But he was honest enough with himself, sitting alone in the breakfast room with the drainage letters unanswered at his elbow, to admit that his own certainty was not the question. The question was what Ashcombe would make of it, and what that making would cost her, and whether a woman who had spent half her life bracing against disappointment might find it easier in the end to retreat to the safety of an old and familiar hurt than to risk her heart a second time on a new and unproven one. "You look," Lady Iseult observed, arriving at the breakfast room in her morning wrapper with the particular briskness of a woman who had clearly been awake for some time composing precisely what she meant to say, like a man who has received bad news and decided the correct response is to eat nothing and speak to no one until it resolves itself. "Good morning, Aunt." "It is not, from the look of you, a good morning at all." She seated herself, poured her own tea with the economy of long habit, and regarded him over the rim of the cup with an expression that mixed exasperation and genuine affection in roughly equal measure. "I will say this once, Fendrel, and then I shall hold my tongue, because I know perfectly well you dislike being managed, and I have managed you quite enough these 3 years since your mother died. I did not press you to attend that assembly because I wished to see you married to a Duchess of Arabella Truillard's stamp, whatever Lady Truillard's fond hopes on the matter. I pressed you because I wished to see you look at a woman the way you looked 3 days ago, walking across a ballroom toward Corenza Carleon. I had begun to fear you had lost the capacity for it entirely." "I have not lost it," he said, more roughly than he intended. "No," she agreed, gently now. "I can see that you have not. Which is precisely why I intend to say nothing further about Mr. Pascoe, except that a woman does not spend 9 years nursing a dying mother and raising 2 younger siblings alone, because she is the sort of creature who abandons a good thing for a familiar disappointment. If she has any sense at all, and everything I hear of her suggests she has more than most women twice blessed with fortune and beauty besides, she will know precisely which of you is worth the keeping." She rose, gathering her wrapper about her with the brisk finality of a woman who considered the conversation closed, and paused at the door long enough to add, over her shoulder, with the particular dryness that ran in the family, "I will say one more thing, and then I promise you my silence. I met Mr. Pascoe once years ago, at his own mother's insistence, when there was still some faint hope in this county that he might make a match of me instead of your Miss Carleon. Before I had the good sense to make it plain, I intended to remain unmarried and troublesome for the rest of my natural life. He struck me, even then, as a man who loved his own comfort a great deal more than he loved anything or anyone else, and 18 months of widowhood is not, in my experience, sufficient time to alter a man's fundamental character, whatever alterations it may work upon his fortune or his loneliness. I should not trouble myself over much about him, Fendrel, except insofar as his return may cause Miss Carleon some pain in the reopening, which is reason enough, I should think, to go to her directly rather than sitting here brooding over a breakfast you have not touched. He was on his horse within the half-hour. He rode to Nunsmere that afternoon without waiting for Sunday, and found Corenza in the garden among her roses, and did not, in the end, need to raise the subject of Nathaniel Pascoe at all, because she raised it herself before he had finished his bow. "You have heard, then." She did not phrase it as a question. "I can see it in your face, your grace, and I confess I find I would rather have the conversation plainly than watch you circle it out of some misplaced delicacy. Mr. Pascoe wrote to me yesterday. A very correct letter, expressing his condolences on my continued unmarried state, his own recent bereavement, and his hope that we might renew our acquaintance now that circumstances have altered for us both. And how did you answer it?" "I have not answered it yet." She met his eyes without flinching, though he saw what it cost her to hold his gaze steady through what came next. "I want you to understand something, your grace, before I tell you what I intend to write. Nathaniel Pascoe broke an engagement with me when I was 21 because my mother's illness made me, in the calculation his family performed at the time, no longer worth the keeping. I grieved that a great deal, once, in the particular way one grieves a thing that has been taken rather than lost, with anger as much as sorrow, because it was not my mother's illness that ended us, it was his family's arithmetic. I have had 19 years to make my peace with that arithmetic. I made it, in the end, by deciding that a man who could be talked out of loving me by the size of my dowry had never loved the thing in me worth loving begin with." She drew a breath. "I do not intend to renew the acquaintance, your grace. I intend to write him a very civil letter informing him that I wish him well in his bereavement, and that I have no interest whatsoever in resuming an attachment that ended, quite thoroughly, 19 years ago. I tell you this not because you have any right to demand it of me. We have known each other 5 days, and I owe you no accounting of my correspondence, but because I find I do not wish there to be any doubt between us on the matter, however new the us of it still is." Something in Fendrel's chest, which had sat tight and cold since the previous evening's message, loosened all at once, and he found himself for a moment entirely unable to speak. "I did not doubt you," he said finally. "I think perhaps you doubted the county's version of me a little," she said, with the ghost of her dry humour returning, "which is understandable, your grace, since the county's version of me has been circulating rather more industriously than the true one this week. But I would rather you doubted rumour than doubted my own account of myself, and I find, having given you that account now plainly, that I trust you to believe it." He closed the last distance between them then, and reached for her hand where it rested against the rose trellis. Not the near touch he had denied himself before, but the thing itself, his fingers closing over hers, warm and steady, and felt her still entirely beneath his touch, not in withdrawal but in something closer to wonder, as though she had genuinely forgotten, across 19 years of being unremarked, what it felt like to be reached for. "I believe you," he said. "I believe you entirely, Corenza." Her name, unadorned by title, felt like a small trespass and a larger gift both at once, and he watched her register it, watched colour rise into her face. "And I find that whatever doubt I carried on the ride here has burned off entirely, and left in its place something considerably more certain than I have any right to feel after 5 days' acquaintance. 5 days is not very long, your grace." But she did not withdraw her hand. "No," he agreed. "It is not, and yet I have spent longer than that deciding the placement of a single field drain, and I do not think I have ever in my life been more certain of anything than I am of this." "You must think me very foolish," she said low, "standing here believing a man I have known 5 days over a memory of a man I once believed I would marry. I think you the least foolish person I have met in a great many years, Corenza." A foolish woman would have written back to Mr. Pascoe by return post, flattered by the attention of a man who once made her feel valuable simply by wanting her. You did not. You sat with his letter a full day and decided, on the strength of your own judgment rather than his renewed interest, precisely what he was worth to you now. That is not foolishness. That is the clearest good sense I have ever had the privilege of watching a person exercise in front of me." She laughed, unsteadily, and the sound of it, genuine, surprised out of her, settled something in his chest that had been tight since the previous evening's message. "You say the most extraordinary things, Your Grace, for a man reputed the length and breadth of this county to be cold as a rudman in January. I find," he said, "that reputation was earned chiefly by having no one worth speaking warmly to. I begin to suspect the defect was never in my temperament at all, only in my company." Neither of them spoke for a long moment, the stream sounding below the wall, the roses heavy with late scent in the warm afternoon air, and he thought, with a clarity that startled him, that he could have stood there considerably longer than propriety allowed, simply holding her hand and watching the last of her wariness give way to something warmer, had not the sound of a carriage on the drive announced a caller neither of them had been expecting. It was Lady Truellard, come ostensibly to pay a call of condolence upon Mr. Carlyon's health, and accompanied by Mrs. Pentreth and Arabella, and it took Fendrel less than a minute in their company to understand that condolence had nothing whatsoever to do with the visit. "Your Grace." Lady Truellard's smile was a masterwork of social construction, warmth stretched taut over something considerably sharper beneath. "What a very great surprise to find you here again. I had thought, but there, I dare say it is only natural for a gentleman to be generous with his attentions to a lady so lately overlooked. It does you great credit, I am sure, to be so kind." "I am not being kind, Lady Truellard." Fendrel did not release Corenza's arm, which he had offered her the moment the carriage appeared, and he felt her stiffen slightly beside him, not, he understood at once, from any wish to be defended, but from long habit. The reflexive bracing of a woman who had spent 19 years absorbing precisely this species of cruelty without expecting rescue from any quarter. "I am courting Miss Carlyon, quite deliberately and quite seriously, and I would take it as a personal favour if the county would retire the notion that my regard for her requires some charitable explanation." Mrs. Pentreth's fan stilled entirely. Arabella, for the first time in Fendrel's brief acquaintance with her, looked genuinely startled out of her studied boredom. "Well," Lady Truellard said faintly, "I am sure I meant nothing by it, Your Grace, beyond concern for Miss Carlyon's, that is, at her age, one cannot help but wonder whether a match of such disparity and I am sure you understand my meaning." "I understand your meaning perfectly, Lady Truellard, and I find it neither kind nor accurate." His voice had gone very quiet, which Charles, had he been present, would have recognized as considerably more dangerous than any raised tone. Miss Carlyon spent 9 years nursing a dying mother, and the better part of 2 decades raising her siblings and keeping her father's house, the cost of every prospect this county might otherwise have offered her. That is not the record of a woman deficient in anything worth valuing. It is the record of a woman this county failed to value properly, and I confess I find myself considerably more interested in remedying that failure than in indulging the gossip that has attended it. The silence that followed was absolute. Corenza's hand had tightened on his arm, and when he glanced at her, he saw her fighting, quite visibly, against an expression that wanted very badly to come something between tears and laughter, the accumulated weight of 19 years of small cruelties meeting, for the first time, a defence she had never once expected to receive. Lady Truellard recovered herself with visible effort, made some correct but hollow remark about the fineness of the weather, and withdrew with her daughter and her ally in a flurry of carriage wheels and unspoken fury that would, Fendrel understood perfectly well, be circulating through every drawing-room in Ashcombe by nightfall. "You did not need to do that," Corenza said quietly, once the carriage had gone. "I know." He turned to face her fully. "I did it because I wanted to, and because I find I am done watching this county mistake your dignity for weakness. I meant what I said to her, Corenza. Every word of it. I know that too." Her eyes were bright, though she held herself too composed to let the brightness fall. "I have been waiting my whole life, without quite admitting it to myself, for someone to say exactly that, in exactly that tone to exactly that woman's face. I did not expect it to be a duke. I did not expect it at all, if I am honest. But I find I am glad it was you, Your Grace, more glad than I know how to say properly." He looked at her for a long moment, the flushed, fierce, wonder-struck honesty of her face, so far from the careful composure she had worn like armor at the assembly a week before, and understood. With the same clean certainty that had carried him across the ballroom floor, that he did not intend to wait upon the slow customary courtship a lesser certainty might have required. He had spent 6 years being patient with everything that did not matter. He did not intend to be patient with the one thing that finally did. He did not go home directly. He rode instead to Charles's small estate at Penvaris, arriving unannounced at an hour that would have been unforgivable in anyone but an old friend, and found Charles in his study with a decanter and an expression that suggested he had been half expecting this visit, since the moment Lady Truelud's carriage had rattled past his own gates an hour before, trailing scandal like smoke. "I have heard already," Charles said, before Fendrel had got his coat off. "Mrs. Pentreth stopped at the Penvaris gate on her way home, ostensibly to ask after my mother's health, and left after 10 minutes, having told me everything that occurred at Nansmere in considerably more colourful terms than I suspect actually applied." "You defended Miss Carlyon to Lady Truelud's face, apparently in a voice cold enough to freeze the Bodmin Road, and declared your intentions in language that has already, by my count, been repeated in at least 3 households before supper." He poured a second glass without being asked and set it in Fendrel's hand. "I take it the account is substantially accurate." "It is." "Then I take it further that you have not come here at this hour merely to confirm gossip I had already heard." Charles studied his friend's face over the rim of his own glass, and whatever he saw there made him set it down again unfinished. "Fendrel, what is it you mean to do?" Fendrel did not answer at once. He turned instead to the window, looking out over Charles's dark garden toward the shape of the hills beyond, the sails that rose, some 3 miles distant, over Nansmere's grey stone roof, and thought of Corenza's face as she had stood before him in the rose garden, the fierce, unguarded gratitude of a woman who had waited 19 years for a single sentence spoken in her defense. "I mean to ask her father for her," he said. "Tonight." Charles set down his glass entirely. "Tonight." "I have courted her a week, Charles. I know precisely how that sounds, and I have spent the ride here attempting to talk myself out of the urgency of it, and I find I cannot. I have watched that county treat a woman of extraordinary substance as though she were furniture for 2 decades, and I have watched her absorb it, quietly, without complaint, because she believed, because the whole of Ashcombe taught her to believe, that complaint would earn her nothing but further pity." He turned back from the window. "I do not intend to give Lady Truelud, or Mrs. Pentreth, or any other soul in this county another week to manufacture doubt where none exists. I do not intend to give Nathaniel Pascoe another week to press his suit, whatever Corenza's own resolve on the matter. And I do not intend, most of all, to give Corenza herself another week in which talk herself back into believing she is not permitted to want what I am offering her. I have watched her do the arithmetic of hope against disappointment once already, in a ballroom, within the length of a single sentence. I do not wish to watch her perform that calculation one moment longer than I can help. You barely know her. I have known men marry after a single London season on considerably less acquaintance than I have gathered of Corenza Carlyon in a week," Fendrel said. "I have watched her nurse a fainting stranger without seeking credit for it. I have watched her defend herself against a room's cruelty without once losing composure, and then watched that same composure crack, entirely and honestly, the moment someone finally troubled to stand beside her instead of merely watching her stand alone. I have sat an hour in her father's parlour discussing drainage, and watched her needlework still in her lap, while she listened to her father laugh for the first time in years. I do not call that barely knowing her, Charles. I call it knowing the whole shape of a person's character in the space of time it takes most people to learn only the shape of their conversation." Charles said nothing for a moment, turning his glass slowly in the candlelight. "You have thought about this a great deal more than you let on when you forked in tonight looking as though the world had ended." "I have thought of little else since Tuesday," Fendrel admitted. "I told myself I was being prudent, weighing the thing properly as a man of my position is meant to weigh a decision of this consequence. I find tonight, watching Lady Truelard's carriage disappear down the Nansmere drive and watching Carenza's face as she thanked me for defending her, that prudence has very little left to say on the matter that certainty has not already settled more plainly. "I know her better," Fendrel said, "than I have known any woman in my life in the space of a week, because she has not once, in the whole of that week, told me anything but the truth. I know what a rare thing that is, Charles, better than most men, having spent a decade being courted for a coronet by women who told me precisely what they calculated I wished to hear. I am not marrying a stranger. I am marrying the only person in 6 years who has troubled to be honest with me from the very first word." Charles was silent for a long moment, turning his glass in his hand, and when he spoke again his voice had lost its caution entirely. "Then go," he said. "God knows I have never seen you look the way you have looked this past week, and if I spend another hour trying to talk you into prudence I shall only be delaying the one decision I have watched you fail to make for 6 long years. Go to Nansmere, Fendrel. And for heaven's sake, take a groom with a lantern. It is nearly full dark already, and that road has a bad turn past the mill." He rode to Nansmere beneath a sky gone violet and then black, the moon not yet risen, his groom's lantern swinging small and steady ahead of him on the road, and found the house. When he arrived, still lit in the downstairs windows, a single candle burning in what he took to be Edmund Carleon's small study. The ride gave him time to think, and he found his thoughts returning, over and over, to the assembly room a week before, to the particular set of Carenza's shoulders as she had absorbed Mrs. Pentreath's cruelty without flinching, to the careful, economical kindness with which she had settled a stranger's shawl, to the honesty with which she had told him, across the length of a single dance, the whole shape of a life spent giving everything she had to people who rarely thought to give anything back. He thought that he had spent 6 years believing himself the loneliest person in this county, burdened by an inheritance no one had asked whether he wanted, and had never once considered that a woman 3 miles from his own gates might have carried a burden fully as heavy, and carried it with considerably less complaint. He did not intend to let another week pass in which she carried it alone. It was the housekeeper who let him in, her face registering surprise and something like alarm at a duke's arrival on the doorstep past 9 at night. But she showed him through to the study without demur, murmuring that Miss Carleon had retired early with a headache and that the master was still up over his accounts. And Fendrel found himself, absurdly, grateful for the headache, not for any wish that Carenza suffer, but because it meant he would have this conversation with her father alone, unwitnessed by the very woman it concerned, in the old and proper way that her father, at least, would recognize and respect. The house was very quiet around him as he waited in the hall for the housekeeper to announce him, quieter than it had been on either of his previous visits. The ordinary daytime sounds of a working household, a maid's footsteps, the clatter of the kitchen, Carenza's own voice calling some instruction from the still-room, all stilled now beneath the settled hush of evening. He found the quiet suited the gravity of what he had come to do. There was something almost sacramental in it, he thought, standing in a modest hallway lined with 3 generations of indifferent Carleon portraits, about to ask an old man for the one thing in his life he had never once, in 6 years of careful decisions, wanted with anything like this urgency. Edmund Carleon looked up from his ledgers with an expression that shifted, in the space of a heartbeat, from surprise to something far more searching. "Your Grace, this is an unusual hour for a call." "It is, sir, and I apologize for the imposition. I would not have come at all tonight, except that I find I cannot, in good conscience, wait until morning to say what I have ridden here to say." Fendrel remained standing, though the old man gestured toward the chair opposite. "I have known your daughter 1 week. I am aware that is scarcely time enough, by any ordinary measure, to ask what I have come to ask, and I would not blame you in the least for telling me to return in a month, or a season, or a year, and prove myself properly before you consider it. But I did not wish to leave you in any doubt of my intention 1 day longer than necessary, because I have watched this county treat Carenza's dignity as an object of speculation for a week now, and I find I would rather settle the matter plainly than allow gossip 1 further hour to do its work unanswered." Edmund Carleon set down his pen very deliberately, folded his hands atop the ledger, and regarded Fendrel with an attention that made the younger man feel, not for the first time in this small study, considerably less than his rank, and considerably more like a boy called to account. You mean to ask for her? I do, sir. Tonight with your permission, though I understand fully if you would rather I waited to ask her myself before extracting any promise from you. No. The old man's voice was quiet, but it carried a weight that filled the small room entirely. No, your grace. I think I would rather hear it from you first, as it was always meant to be done, before the fashions of a careless age decided fathers were an inconvenience to be managed round rather than consulted. He was silent a moment, and when he spoke again his voice had thickened, very slightly, with something he was plainly working hard to master. Do you know, your grace, I had given up hope of this conversation entirely. Not merely this past week's hope, mind. I mean, I had given it up years ago, quietly. The way one gives up hope of a thing one has decided is simply not to be. I watched my daughter give the whole of her youth to her mother's sickbed without complaint, and to her brother and sister without complaint, and to me, in my own grief, without complaint, and I told myself, God forgive me, that it was no more than any dutiful daughter owed her family, and I did not trouble myself overmuch with what it cost her, until one day I looked up from my own sorrow and found she was 35 years old, and the county had already stopped inviting her to anything that mattered. His hand, resting on the ledger, trembled with age, Fendrel thought, or with something considerably less steady than age alone. I have prayed for this, your grace. In the private and unworthy way a man prays for things he has told himself he no longer deserves to want. I would be a poor father indeed if I made you wait upon a formality when what you are offering her is the very thing I stopped believing anyone would offer at all. Then I have your blessing, sir. You have considerably more than my blessing. Edmund Carleon rose, unsteadily, and Fendrel crossed the room at once to steady his arm, an instinct the old man accepted without complaint, leaning on it for a moment longer than pride would ordinarily have permitted. You have my gratitude, your grace, which I do not offer lightly, and which I do not believe I shall ever be able to express to you in terms adequate to what you are giving her. She does not yet know you have come tonight? No, sir. I understood she had retired with a headache. A faint wry smile crossed the old man's face, the first rumour Fendrel had seen in him since their first meeting over the drainage discussion. She does not have a headache, your grace. She has spent the whole of the evening walking the length of the garden and back again, over and over, since Lady Truelod's carriage left this afternoon, in a state of agitation I have not seen in her since she was a very young woman, and when I asked her what troubled her she told me she did not know how to bear being happy after so long a practice at bearing everything else. I sent her up an hour ago and told her a headache would serve as well as any other excuse for a woman who needed an evening alone to sit with a feeling she had not expected to have again. He looked at Fendrel steadily. I do not think, your grace, that she is asleep. I think you will find her at her window, if you care to look, watching the drive, though she would deny it to her last breath if you asked her outright. There is one thing more I would ask of you, your grace, before you go to her. Edmund Carleon's voice had steadied again, though his eyes remained bright. Be plain with her. She has had a lifetime of people speaking to her in careful, softened terms, out of pity or discomfort or simple thoughtlessness, as though the truth were too heavy a thing to hand a woman who has already carried so much. She does not want gentleness of that kind, whatever the world assumes a woman of her years and situation must want. She wants to be told the truth plainly, and trusted to bear it, the way she has borne everything else in her life. If you love her, tell her so without softening it into something smaller than it is. I intend to, sir. I have never in my life felt less inclined towards softening anything. The old man studied him a moment longer and then nodded, once the gesture of a man who had said what he needed to say and trusted it would be honoured. Then go, your grace, before I grow sentimental enough to embarrass us both further. I find I have had quite enough excitement for one evening, and I should like to sit with my own gladness a while before the household is roused by whatever comes next. Fendrel felt something shift in his chest, warm and urgent both at once, the sense of a decision already made, tightening into something with no possibility of retreat, and finding in that tightening not fear but a settled and complete relief, as though he had spent 6 years bracing against a weight that had, quite suddenly, been lifted clean away. "Then, with your permission, sir," he said, "I should like to go and find out whether her father's guess is correct." He found her exactly where her father had said he would, not at her window precisely, but in the garden below it, wrapped in a shawl against the night air. Standing among the roses in the near dark with her face turned up toward a sky, just beginning to show its first stars, and he understood, watching her from the garden gate before she had heard his approach, that Edmund Carleon knew his daughter better than she believed anyone still did. Carenza. She turned, startled, one hand rising to her throat, and for a moment he saw the whole unguarded shape of her surprise before she had time to compose it into anything more careful. Surprise, and beneath it, unmistakably, a leap of something she had not yet permitted herself to name. "Your Grace. I did not expect. My father did not tell me you had come again tonight." Her eyes searched his face in the dim light, and he watched her register, with the particular acuity of a woman who had spent her whole life reading the small signs other people missed. That something in him was different from the man who had left her that afternoon. "Has something happened?" "I have spoken with your father." He crossed the garden path toward her, slowly, giving her every opportunity to retreat if retreat was what she wanted, and found she did not take it. Stood her ground among the roses, watching him come with an expression caught somewhere between hope and disbelief, as though she did not yet trust herself to guess correctly what this meant. "I have asked him for you, Carenza, and he has given his blessing, and his gratitude besides, in terms I do not believe I shall ever fully deserve." She went very still. Tonight. I know how it must sound. "I have courted you a single week, and I am aware that every rule of prudence this county holds dear would counsel me to wait a month, a season, whatever interval convention demands before a man may reasonably claim to know his own heart. I find I do not care what convention demands." He stopped before her, close enough now that he could see the fine tremor in the hand still resting at her throat, close enough to see her breath come quick and unsteady in the cool night air. "I have spent 6 years being prudent, Carenza. Prudent with my estate, prudent with my grief, prudent with every particle of my own life, because I believed prudence was the whole of what was required of me, and I never once questioned whether it was also robbing me of anything worth having. I am done being prudent about this. I do not wish to wait a season to tell you what I already know. I love you. I loved you, I think, from the moment I watched you settle Mrs. Kessel's shawl about her shoulders without once looking to see if the room was watching you do it. And I have loved you a little more with every hour since. Watching you meet 19 years of this county's cruelty with more grace than it deserved from you, and more honesty with me than I have earned from anyone in longer than I can properly remember, I am asking you to marry me. Not because I pity what this county has denied you, and not because I wish to make some grand gesture against Lady Truillard's malice, though I confess I shall enjoy that particular consequence a great deal. I am asking because I cannot imagine, having found you, spending one more season pretending I have not." For a long moment she said nothing at all, and he watched, with his heart in his throat in a way he had not experienced since he was very young and considerably less certain of the world than he had believed himself to be an hour before. The whole careful architecture of 19 years' composure move across her face, the old instinct to guard, to doubt, to perform calm rather than feel it, warring visibly with something far more urgent trying to break through. "I have spent so long," she said finally, and her voice, when it came, was not steady at all, "telling myself that hope was a luxury I had outgrown, Your Grace. That it was easier, and kinder to myself, to want nothing, than to want a thing I could not have and grieve its absence a second time. I told myself that at the assembly, when Mrs. Pentrith said what she said, and I very nearly believed I had succeeded at it, until you crossed the room and I found," her voice caught, and she pressed on through it, "I found I had not succeeded at all. I had only buried it very deep. And it took one dance to bring it all the way back up again, and I have spent this whole week frightened half to death that I would let myself want this, truly want it, and then lose it, and discover the losing hurt worse than 19 years of never having hoped at all. You will not lose it." He reached for her hand, the one still trembling at her throat, and drew it gently down and into his own, and felt her fingers close around his with a fierceness that told him more than any words could have. I do not offer things I do not intend to keep, Corenza. I told you that the first night, and I have not changed in the week since. I am not a young man given to sudden fancies. I am a man of 41 who has weighed a great many decisions carefully in his life and found, in this one alone, that no amount of weighing was necessary at all, because the answer arrived complete the moment I saw you. Then say it again, she said, low, so that I know I have not imagined it. I love you, he said, and I am asking you to be my wife, and to be the Duchess of Rudmind, and to let me spend whatever years remain to either of us proving to you, every single day of them, that you were never woman this county believed you to be, that you were always the woman I found in that ballroom, worth crossing any room and any convention and any season's careful waiting to reach. She was crying now, quietly, without the least attempt to hide it, and he lifted his free hand to her face, brushing the tears away with a gentleness that made her close her eyes and lean very slightly into his touch, the whole of her guard finally, completely undone. Yes, she said. Yes, your grace, Fendrel, yes, 1,000 times yes, though I confess I do not entirely know how to hold a happiness this large after so long a practice at holding so little. You will learn, he said, and drew her hand to his lips. As I intend to learn it beside you, and for a long moment neither of them said anything further at all, the garden dark and fragrant around them, the roses her mother had once planted standing witness to a thing neither of them had believed, 1 week before, still remained possible in either of their lives. Nathaniel Pascoe called at Nansmere 3 days later, uninvited and, by Fendrel's own account of the visit, entirely undeterred by the civil letter Corenza had sent him. Fendrel happened to be present when the man's carriage arrived, an unremarkable, well-made vehicle that spoke of comfortable means rather than any great fortune, and watched, from the window of Edmund Carleon's small study, a stocky, sandy-haired gentleman of about 45 step down and straighten his coat with the particular self-satisfaction of a man who has not yet considered the possibility of refusal. "Shall I leave you to receive him alone?" Fendrel asked, though he made no move toward the door. "You shall do nothing of the kind." Corenza's chin had taken on the set he had come to recognize in their fortnight's acquaintance as the surest sign of her resolve. "I have nothing to say to Mr. Pascoe that I am ashamed to say in front of you, your grace, and I find I would very much like you to hear it." Pascoe was shown into the parlor with evident confidence, a confidence that faltered only slightly at the sight of Fendrel standing by the mantel, and recovered itself quickly enough once introductions had been made, though his eyes moved, once or twice, between the Duke and Corenza with the beginnings of a calculation Fendrel found he had very little patience for. "Miss Carleon. Corenza, if I may, we were, after all, once very nearly family to each other." Pascoe's smile was practiced, warm in the way of a man accustomed to warmth being well received. "I confess your letter surprised me. I had hoped, given all that has passed, both my own loss, your long years of devotion to your family, that we might find our way back to an understanding. I have thought of you often these 18 months, more often than I believe I ought to admit in present company. Then I am sorry to have surprised you a second time, Mr. Pascoe, though I find I am not sorry for the substance of what I wrote." Corenza's voice was perfectly even, without a trace of the old wound Fendrel had heard in it at the assembly. "I do not say this to wound you. I say it because I think you are owed the plain truth rather than a polite evasion. I spent 19 years believing that what ended between us was a tragedy of circumstance, my mother's illness, the unlucky timing of it, nothing that either of us could have prevented. I have come to understand in recent weeks that it was not circumstance at all. It was choice you chose, when the cost of loving me grew inconvenient, to stop. I do not hold that against you any longer, Mr. Pascoe. 19 years is a long time to carry anger, and I find I have set it down at last. But I will not mistake a widower's loneliness for a change of heart, and I will not offer you a second chance at a choice you have already once made plain." Pascoe's composure slipped briefly into something considerably less practiced. "I see," he said, and glanced again at Fendrel, and whatever he read in the Duke's expression seemed to settle the matter for him more thoroughly than any words could have. He rose, made his farewells with what remained of his dignity, and did not, so far as either of them ever heard, trouble Ashcombe with his presence again that season. That, Fendrel said once the carriage had rattled away down the drive, was very well said. It was very long overdue, Corenza replied, and there was nothing in her face now but a settled, quiet lightness, the particular relief of a woman who has finally set down a weight she had carried so long she had nearly forgotten it was not simply a part of her own shape. The banns were read at Ashcombe Parish Church a fortnight later, and Fendrel stood beside her in the family pew, an arrangement Edmund Carleon had insisted upon, declaring that the whole county might as well see the truth of it plainly rather than continue speculating from the shadows. And watched, with a satisfaction he made no effort whatsoever to disguise, the ripple of astonishment move through the congregation as the curate's voice named them both. Lady Truillard's face in the third pew achieved an expression of such profound and studied neutrality that Fendrel understood it had cost her a considerable effort of will. Mrs. Pentreath did not manage neutrality at all, and sat through the remainder of the service with the fixed, glassy look of a woman recalculating, in real time, every unkind word she had ever spoken within earshot of the woman now confirmed to be a future duchess. Arabella Truillard, to her credit, caught Corenza's eye afterward in the churchyard, and after a visible struggle with herself, offered a curtsy and a stammered, genuine-sounding congratulation that Corenza accepted with a warmth Fendrel thought considerably more grace than the girl's mother had earned on the family's behalf. Mrs. Kessel, seated beside them throughout the service, wept openly, and without the least embarrassment through the whole of the reading, and afterward, in the churchyard, took both of Fendrel's hands in her own and declared, loudly enough for half the departing congregation to hear, that she had known the moment she saw him cross that ballroom floor that he was a man of proper sense, and that she intended to remind everyone of her early and superior judgment for as long as her health permitted her the pleasure. Edmund Carleon, standing beside her, said nothing at all, but the look on his face, unguarded, brimming entirely without his usual dry reserve, told Fendrel more plainly than any speech could have precisely what the morning had cost him in old grief and given him back in new gladness. Charles, for his part, made a point of shaking Fendrel's hand with exaggerated solemnity and murmuring that he expected to be named godfather to the first child on the strength of having personally witnessed the whole campaign from its opening skirmish at the punch table. A suggestion Fendrel did not trouble to dignify with a response beyond a look that made his old friend laugh outright in the middle of the churchyard. Of Nathaniel Pascoe there was no further word. Corenza had sent her letter, brief and entirely civil, the week before the banns were read, and whatever he had made of it, he did not appear at Ashcombe again that season, and Fendrel found he did not think of the man at all, except with a distant and entirely unbothered gratitude that his own family's arithmetic, 19 years before, had left this particular woman free to be found by someone who understood her worth properly. "You are staring," Corenza said, some weeks later, as they walked the Rodminde home wood together in the last mild gold of the autumn afternoon, her hand tucked into his arm with an ease that had grown, week by week, entirely natural to them both. "I am admiring," he said. "There is a difference." "Is there?" But she was smiling the wide, unguarded smile that had become, in these past weeks, so much more frequent a visitor to her face than the careful composure he had first admired at the assembly. "I confess I am still learning to be looked at so plainly, Your Grace." 19 years is a long habit to unlearn. "Then I intend to spend a good deal longer than 19 years helping you unlearn it," he said, "starting with every day for the rest of our lives, if you will permit me the practice." "I believe," she said, drawing him to a stop beneath the last of the wood's turning leaves, "that I shall permit you a great deal more than that." Behind them, faint on the wind, came the sound of Rodminde's stable clock striking the hour, and ahead of them, through the trees, the first lit windows of the house that would, within the month, be hers as much as his. And Fendrel, looking down at the woman beside him, thought that of all the careful decisions he had made in 6 long years of duty and prudence, this single reckless one, arrived at in the space of a single ballroom evening and confirmed within a single week, was the only one he had never once, not for a moment since, thought to question. The morning of the wedding broke clear and mild over Ashcombe, the kind of soft autumn light that seemed, to Fendrel, standing at the front of the parish church in a coat his valet had pressed for the third time since dawn, to have been ordered specially for the occasion, though he was aware enough of his own state to know that any weather at all would have looked golden to him that particular morning. He had risen before dawn, unable to sleep past the first grey light through his chamber windows, and had spent the early hours walking the Rudmine grounds alone, past the home wood and down as far as the boundary wall that marked, however arbitrarily, the line between his own land and the modest acres of Nansmere beyond it. He had stood there some while, watching the mist lift slowly off the fields, and had thought, with a clarity that surprised him even after 2 months of growing certainty, that he did not feel the least trepidation any sensible man was meant to feel on the morning of so consequential a decision. He felt only a kind of settled gladness, as though he had spent his whole adult life walking toward this particular morning without knowing its shape until now that he stood so near it. Charles stood beside him, as he had stood beside him at every important juncture of his life since they were boys together in the Rudmine trout stream, and leaned close enough to murmur, "You are fidgeting, Fendrel. I have never in 30 years seen you fidget. I am not fidgeting. You have straightened that cravat 4 times in as many minutes. It is a very important cravat." Charles laughed low and clapped him once on the shoulder, and said nothing further, because the church door had opened, and the small congregation gathered within, considerably larger than either Fendrel or Corenza had expected, for the whole county, it seemed, had discovered a sudden and urgent desire to witness the wedding it had spent 2 months discussing, rose as one, and Fendrel forgot entirely how to breathe properly. She came up the aisle on her father's arm, and Edmund Carleon, who had grown visibly stronger these past weeks, Fendrel thought, on nothing more medicinal than the sight of his daughters as happiness restored to her, walked with a steadiness that owed less to age recovering than to sheer determination not to falter on this particular morning of all mornings. Corenza wore ivory silk, not the fashionable extravagance a younger bride might have chosen, but simple and beautifully made, with her mother's pearls at her throat, pearls Fendrel knew, because she had told him quietly the week before that she had kept in a drawer for 19 years without once imagining an occasion worthy of wearing them, and had very nearly wept when she took them out at last and found they still fit as though no time at all had passed. She did not look walking toward him like a woman the county had once dismissed as past hoping. She looked, Fendrel thought, watching her come with his whole chest gone tight and full at once, like exactly what she was. A woman who had spent the better part of her life giving everything she had to everyone who needed her, and had finally, at 40 years old, arrived at the one moment in which the whole of the giving was reversed, and something was being given entirely, unreservedly to her. Edmund Carleon placed his daughter's hand in Fendrel's with a grip that lingered a moment longer than strictly necessary, and murmured, too low for anyone but the 2 of them to hear, "Take care of her, your grace, though I confess after these past weeks I no longer doubt that you will," and stepped back to his place beside the elder Mrs. Kessel, who was already dabbing at her eyes with a handkerchief she had, by her own later admission, brought expressly prepared for the purpose. The service passed, as such services do, in a blur that Fendrel would afterward remember less as a sequence of words than as a series of sensations. The warmth of Corenza's hand in his, steady now where it had trembled that night in the garden, the sound of her voice, clear and unwavering, making vows he understood she had once believed she would never have occasion to make, the particular, private look she gave him when the curate pronounced them husband and wife, a look that held nothing of the guarded composure he had first met in a crowded ballroom, and everything of the woman he had spent 2 months learning existed beneath it. The service itself passed for Fendrel in the particular suspended quiet he had heard other married men describe and never quite believed until now. The curate's voice steady and familiar, the small congregation hushed with genuine feeling rather than mere ceremony, and beneath it all, unwavering, the plain fact of Corenza's hand in his, her voice answering each vow without a single tremor, though he could feel, through the warmth of her fingers, the full weight of what this moment meant to a woman who had spent 20 years believing it would never be hers to have. When the curate at last pronounced them married, a sound went through the church that was not quite applause and not quite a sigh, but something warmer than either, the sound, Fendrel thought, of an entire community exhaling a held breath it had not fully realized it was holding on her behalf. Outside, the churchyard had filled with well-wishers, tenants from both Rodmind and Nansmere, neighbours who had known Corenza her whole life and had, in the flush of a wedding morning, conveniently forgotten every unkind word they might once have spoken about her prospects, and even, at the edge of the crowd, Lady Truillard herself, who approached with Arabella at her side and offered, with what Fendrel privately considered a heroic effort at graciousness, her sincere congratulations to the new Duchess of Rodmind. "I am sure," Lady Truillard said, holding Corenza's hands in her own with a warmth that would have astonished her considerably had she overheard herself speaking so 2 months prior, "that I always said you had more sense and more heart than half the young misses in this county put together, my dear. I do not doubt his Grace has chosen wisely." Fendrel, standing close enough to hear the whole of this remarkable revision of history, caught Corenza's eye over Lady Truillard's shoulder and saw, in the small private curve of her mouth, that she had heard it exactly as he had, not with bitterness, but with a warmth of her own that surprised him, the warmth of a woman generous enough to accept a graceless apology in the spirit it was, however clumsily, intended. "You are very kind, Lady Truillard," Corenza said, and meant it, or meant enough of it that the sincerity carried. And Fendrel thought, watching her extend that grace so freely to a woman who had wounded her more than once, that it was perhaps the clearest evidence yet of everything in her he had come to love. A heart large enough to have carried 19 years of disappointment without curdling into bitterness, and large enough now to make room easily for happiness that had come to her so late and so completely. Mrs. Pentreath, for her part, offered a curtsy considerably lower than the occasion strictly required, and a compliment so effusive it verged on parody, and Fendrel suspected, from the faint, private amusement in Corenza's eyes as they moved on through the crowd, that his wife found the woman's reversal considerably more entertaining than wounding at this remove, the sting of old cruelty dulled, entirely, by the plain fact of standing in a churchyard as a duchess with her husband's hand at the small of her back, surrounded by people who had once thought her beneath their notice, and now could not compliment her fast enough. Mrs. Kessel held court near the Lick Gate for the better part of an hour, accepting congratulations on her own behalf as though she had personally arranged the entire match. Told anyone who would listen, which by that stage of the morning, nearly everyone within earshot, that she had always known Corenza Carleon was destined for something considerably grander than the quiet, overlooked life the county had assigned her, and that she intended to take the fullest possible credit for having fainted so opportunely at the precise moment a duke happened to be watching. Fendrel, overhearing this claim for perhaps the 3rd time, caught Corenza's eye across the churchyard and found her already laughing, silently behind her gloved hand, at the sheer audacity of her aunt's revised history. Even the younger women of the parish, who had spent 2 decades regarding Corenza with the particular indifference the young reserve for anyone they consider to have already lived the whole of her interesting years, pressed forward now with a curiosity that bordered on reverence, as though her example had opened some new and unexpected possibility in their own understanding of what a life might yet hold, however long delayed. Fendrel watched his wife receive their attention with the same unaffected grace she had shown Lady Truillard's apology and Mrs. Pentreath's effusions alike, and thought that whatever the county had failed to see in her these 20 years, it saw now, plainly and completely, and would not soon forget the lesson of its own blindness. They did not stay long at the wedding breakfast that followed at Rodmind, long enough for the toasts for Charles's speech, which managed to be both genuinely moving and true to his promise, thoroughly insufferable in its teasing of the bridegroom's 6-year avoidance of every ballroom in the county, long enough for Edmund Carleon to rise, unsteadily but with real strength in his voice, and offer a toast of his own that left very few eyes in the room entirely dry. Speaking of a daughter who had given the whole of her youth to duty without once being asked whether she wished to, and who had at last, at 40 years old, been given something owed to her a very great deal sooner, by the time the light began to slant gold and long across the Rodmind lawns. Fendrel found Carenza had slipped away from the gathering crowd and went to find her, and discovered her exactly where he had somehow known he would, standing at the edge of the rose garden his own mother had planted decades before, in the last of the September warmth. Her wedding finery already loosened at the throat, watching the light move across a house that was, from this day forward, entirely hers. "I have been thinking," she said, without turning, aware of his approach by some instinct that had grown between them these past 2 months, "about the woman I was at the Ashcombe Assembly 2 months ago. Standing against the wall in that grey gown, quite certain that whatever remained of my life would be a quiet, small thing, lived at the edges of other people's happiness rather than in any happiness of my own. And what do you make of her now?" "I am grateful to her, I think." She turned to face him, the low sun-catching gold in eyes that had lost entirely the worriness he had first met there. She was tired, and she had every reason to be tired, and she had stopped hoping because hoping had cost her too much, too many times to seem worth the risk any longer. But she did not stop being kind, even when kindness earned her nothing. She still settled Mrs. Kessel's shawl about her shoulders, even believing no one in that ballroom would ever think to do the same for her. I am glad I was her, in the end, whatever it cost. I do not think I would have known how to receive what you offered me, if I had not first learned, in all those quiet years, exactly what it meant to give it. Fendrel closed the distance between them and took both her hands in his, standing among his mother's roses with his wife of a single afternoon, and thought that he had never, in 6 years of careful, dutiful, prudent decisions, made one that had returned to him so entirely more than he had risked. "I love you," he said, "not despite those years, Carenza, but because of everything they made you. I do not wish you to think, even for a moment, that I see this marriage as some rescue, some correction of a wrong the county did you. I see it as the plainest good fortune of my life, that a woman of your substance and your patience and your extraordinary heart happened to be standing against a wall in a ballroom the one evening I finally troubled myself to look properly. Then we are both fortunate," she said, "for I had quite genuinely stopped believing anyone would ever cross that room for me at all, and here I stand, married to the one man in it who did." He drew her close, there among the roses, in the last warm light of their wedding day, and kissed her. Gently, unhurriedly, with all the certainty that had carried him across a crowded ballroom floor 2 months before, and all the tenderness that had grown, day by careful day, into something neither of them any longer doubted would last the whole of their lives. Behind them, faint across the lawns, came the sound of the wedding party's continued celebration, laughter and music drifting on the evening air. But for a long moment neither of them turned back toward it, content simply to stand together in the quiet, golden hush of the garden, two people who had each, in their own long, separate ways, given up hoping for exactly this, and had found, against every expectation either of them had permitted themselves to hold, that it had been waiting for them after all. In the years that followed, the story of the Duke of Rudmind and his Duchess became, in its own quiet way, a favourite one in that corner of Cornwall, told not with the malice that had once attended Carenza's name in Ashcombe drawing-rooms, but with something warmer, something that mothers came to tell their daughters when those daughters despaired, in their own turn, of ever being truly seen. It was said, and said truly, that the Duke had crossed a crowded room for a woman the world had stopped looking at, and had spent every year of their marriage afterward making certain she never doubted, not for a single day, that he had been right to do it. It was said that Carenza Carleon, who had been 40 years old and quite certain her chance at happiness had passed her by, had instead been waiting all along for the one man capable of recognizing what the rest of the world had carelessly overlooked. And it was said, most simply and most truly of all, that theirs had been a love built, non-youth or fashion or fortune, but on the plainest and rarest thing of all, two people who had each learned, through long and difficult years, exactly how to be worthy of being chosen, and who had at last chosen each other.